So we're starting off with topic number 6.2. This is social class and educational attainment. And before we get started with this, I'd like to remind us all about in school factors and out school factors. Now, when I talk about these in school factors and out school factors, in school factors and out school factors, these in school factors and out school factors and the effect, number one, what are they? Number two, how do they affect the educational attainment of pupils? Now when we talk about out school factors can be the factors outside your school as an institution that affect the educational attainment of a pupil. We could talk about social class. Your social class is an out school factor. We could talk about your ethnicity. We could talk about your gender, or we could talk about your intelligence. All of these factors, they come under the heading of out school factors. And on the other hand, when we speak about in school factors, we have factors such as your everyday school environment, your experience at school rather. Your teachers play an important role over here. Your pupil subcultures play an important role over here. Yeah, so on and so forth. Now, why is it that we are referring to them as in school or out school factors? We're referring to them as in school or out school factors because, your school doesn't really have to do with your school plays no role in determining or affecting your social class. If you belong to a rich family or a poor family, the school isn't considered to be responsible for that, nor is the case for your ethnicity, your gender, or your level of intelligence. However, on the other hand, if we speak about in school factors can be your everyday school environment, right? In school, within school, right? In school factors have to do with your everyday school routine, your management, your teachers, your fellow pupils that together make a pupil subculture, so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about these out school factors, in the last class we had spoken about intelligence, the role intelligence plays in terms of affecting your educational attainment. And today we discuss how social class plays its role in terms of affecting your educational attainment. Now, of course, this comes without saying when we speak about or as we speak about social class, Marxism or the Marxist perspective plays a very important or a contributory role towards explaining how your social class ends up affecting your educational attainment. Now, keeping all of this in mind, if I officially formally start off with topic 6.2, the relationship between material factors and educational attainment. We're talking about your material factors and your educational attainment. What is the relationship between them? Now, to start off with, what exactly is material factors, or what do we refer to when we talk about material factors? As we refer to material factors over here, this includes a combination of different factors that put the working class students under some disadvantage, right? And in contrast, they are the factors that give a push to the pupils from the upper class or the pupils from the middle class, right? To start off with, now, we're talking about a combination of factors that give working class students a disadvantage in the education system. To start off with, we could refer to poor nutrition, right? Now, individuals or pupils from the working class, you all do have an idea if a child is if a child doesn't really get to eat proper food, don't you think that is going to affect the concentration level of a child? I'll give you a very simple example over here. You know what? During your exam, during these days, right, when you when your poor parents, not poor but when they're getting you anything and everything you want to eat just so that you can concentrate on your studies. I've heard parents mention their kids want them to order pizzas and god knows what, just because they say they'd study better. So that's you, because you come from a privileged class. However, on the other hand, if you speak about pupils from the working class, it might not be possible for them, right? It might not be possible for their parents to even provide them adequate food that has all the nutrition in it, right? That could be one factor, number one. Number two, a lack of private study facility. Now everyone, all of you, has a place at at your home where you can sit and study, right? If not anything else, you'd have a drawing room that you could occupy and sit and concentrate. What if someone who has a family of 8 people and they live in 2 rooms? Do you think it would be possible for them? Number three, the third factor, many working class peoples have to end up supplementing their family income, which again makes them do double of work, which can affect their educational attainment. Number four, they're more vulnerable to illnesses and diseases, probably because of where they live, probably because of a lack of nutritious food, right? Next, the areas students live in may also lead to disadvantage. The areas the students live in. Now, those areas could be overcrowded. Now, if you talk about a country like ours, there could be sewage problems, there could be problems in terms of electricity. I mean, that happens quite often. Not everyone has an alternative. You do today. Multiple ones, someone have, a few of you would be having multiple options. But then again, individuals from a working class background might not have that facility. The last one, lack of community facilities such as public library, levels of crime, drug abuse, and so on. All of these factors, they we would consider them under the heading of material deprivation. All of these factors, according to the Marxist perspective, do end up affecting the educational attainment of pupils. Right? I hope this is clear. Moving on. Now, this, if we if you talk about a developing country like India, in some developing countries like India. According to Ramachandran, she claims that Indian schools, many of Indian schools, 50% of them have a leaking roof or no water supply. 35% have no blackboards or furniture. 90% have no functioning toilet. Now, in a situation like this, don't you think the educational attainment of pupils, and of course, when you're talking about 90% of them having no functioning toilets, we're talking about the schools that are populated by working class children, children from a less privileged background. She further argues malnutrition, hunger, and poor health remains core problems, which comprehensively affect attendance and performance in classes. The added burden of home chores and child labor influence a large number of children, especially girls, to drop out of school. Now, all of this, don't you think, does come under the heading of material deprivation? Don't you think all of this comes under the heading of how your social class ends up affecting your educational attainment? It does, right? Now, moving on. If you talk about social class and underachievement, now, social class and underachievement, when I talk about social class and underachievement, I am actually referring to the working class, the pupils from a working class background, how they underachieve, right? The major differences between the levels of achievement of the working class and middle class in general. The higher the social class of the parent, the more successful a child will be in education. What we're talking about over here is a correlation between the social class a child belongs to and their educational attainment. In other words, a child from a working class having lesser chances of doing well in school or the educational journey. However, compare that with a child from the middle class having more of chances, right? A correlation, a relationship between the social class you belong to and your educational success in future. Social class inequality in education begins even before children start their primary school. Now that's a nice one here. I'm sure you'd many of you would agree to this. When we talk about this these disadvantages starting off even before a child goes to school, you know how kids from a middle class and the upper class or a privileged background, how their parents get them all the facilities beforehand. Now, in the last class, we were discussing about how their parents make a point that their home background keeps on complementing their school environment, because the middle class, because we're studying all of this under the Marxist perspective, because the schools are majorly run under with the value system that goes in line with the middle class. तो एक मिडिल क्लास के बच्चे के लिए स्कूल के अंदर जाके एडजस्ट करना, स्कूल की वैल्यूज को अडेप्ट करना आसान होता है रिलेटिवली इफ यू कंपेयर दैट विद अ child from the working class background. Now, how is it that these differences emerge or begin even before a child joins school? For instance, you know what, you've seen, I mean, I have so many nephews and nieces that I hear about their parents, they're working so hard towards uh, training the kids beforehand so that when they join school they don't really experience any problem. They, many children from the middle class background, they know how to read and at times write too. Before they've even joined school, they can identify, you show them an apple and they'll be like, hey, that's an apple, even when English is not a mother tongue. The way their parents communicate with them, that is an added advantage that puts them into a better position, in a better position if you compare them with children from the working class who do not have all of these facilities, right? So social class inequality in education begins even before children start their primary school, and the gap between the classes becomes wider as children move through the education system, right? The If this is something like this, right, as they progress with their education, the speed with the children from the middle class progress and the speed with the children from the working class progress, दोनों के अंदर difference होता है. This gap keeps on becoming wider with the high levels of system being dominated by children from the middle class, upper class, elite class, privileged position. Get it? Now, low working class children compared to middle class children of the same ability, how is it that they are in a disadvantaged position? Number one, they already feel well behind, they already are well behind in the education development even before they get to school. This we have discussed, I think this is underlined already, I'll just highlight it. Number two, they are most likely to start school unable to read, whereas children from the middle class, they do less well in the national curriculums, the standard assessment tests, right? Number four, they are less likely to get places in the best state schools because of their housing, because of them not being able to communicate well, because their parents not being in a position to raise a, what do you call it, what's the word, to if you apply somewhere it doesn't work, what do? You send a reapplication, or what is it called, something. I mean, if they are not able to get to the school they want to, their parents might not know that they have an option of reapplying, right? Number four, number five, they're most likely to be placed in lower streams. Number six, they generally get poor exam results. 3 out of 5 from the middle class get 5 or more asterisk in GCSE, and less than 1 out of 3 from working class. We have statistical support over here. Number seven, they're more likely to leave school at a minimum leaving age of 17, right? Remember, that is when children in the UK actually do get a chance, do get an option of leaving school if they want to, right? This is when quite a lot of children from the working class, they get the shit off, and it's the middle class or beyond, the children of the elite, who continue with education from here onwards. Number 8, they're more likely to undertake vocational training. Number 9, they're less likely to go into higher education. And I don't think there's anything, if this just requires a simple read, you read through it and I'm sure you all do get this, right? So we were talking about the relationship between social class and underachievement over here, right? Moving on, if I take this a step further, if we talk about JWB Douglas, according to Douglas, material deprivation is too broad an explanation for all forms of underachievement, because some materially deprived children do manage to succeed. Now, how is it that they're managing to succeed? There are numerous factors that we could attribute towards that as well, right? Working class attainment also tends to fall throughout a child's education. Now, we're talking about the working class attainment falling, like we discussed, as the child progresses, right? As the child, if you talk about two kids from the same, uh, let's say they both have the same abilities, as they progress with education, there are more chances that a child from the working class, they tend to fall behind the children from the middle class, right? Now, when we're talking about all of this happening during the time period that a child is going to school, don't you think we can even consider the possibility of something going on within the school that is causing all of this? Or, in other words, I'm trying to hint you on in school factors, right? And when we talk about these in school factors, we have processes such as labeling. You all know what labeling is: someone being called a smart child and someone being called a not so smart child. And in this case, children from the middle class, just because they match your value system, belief system, they come from the same background, if the teachers, they start labeling pupils in terms of how smart or not so smart they are based on the social class they belong to, this can cause problems. Of course, all of this does come under the heading of in school factors, right? Likewise, we could speak about stereotyping, how stereotyping plays its role, how labeling stereotype, you know what stereotyping is: labeling. Low teacher students expectations. If the teachers do not have high expectations from pupils from the middle, from the pupils from the working class, that can affect their education, again their education attainment. Or considered, that's not later, that's later, considered later, are potentially significant explanations, right? Now, we have another reference over here, and through which we should note this. See, levels of working class achievement can be raised, but the behavior and expectations of teachers can also increase, compound the levels of material and cultural disadvantage that many working class children bring to the school. Now, do you know what? A child from a working class background, if he or she is coming in with a comparatively disadvantaged position, right? As he or she joins school, right? One, they're coming up with a disadvantaged position. Number two, what the teachers can do is the teachers can just make it worse by having low expectations, by having a stereotypical image of what a child can perform and cannot perform, right? All of this could be a contributory factor towards the working class child not doing well, or not being able to do as well as the child from the middle class does, right? Now, taking it ahead, to remind you all, we're discussing all of this under the heading of the relationship between social class and educational attainment, right? Moving on, if we talk about cultural explanations, now, as we refer to cultural explanations, I'd like to bring in parental attitudes, values, speech codes, and cultural capital, right? Now, parental attitude. How or to what extent do you think parental attitude does have its contribution? There are different sociological commentators who have different stances on this, but according to Douglas, a child from a middle class background gets more of encouragement, more of support, more of guidance from their parents as compared to a child from the working class background. Now, Douglas claims the impact on educational attainment are variables. There are certain variables that affect the educational attainment, and in this case, we talk about parental attitudes. This is expressed in terms of the levels of encouragement and interest in a child's education. You've seen how middle class parents are so concerned about the child's education if you compare that with a parent from the working class background. Number two, the family size. Working class families, they usually large, with there being fewer resources. Of course, If there are two families, one family has four people to feed and the other has 14 to feed, the family that has four people to feed would be in a better position to make investments on their child's future as compared to a family of 14. Number three, the third factor, position within the family. I don't really like this one, but still. Older children tend to achieve more than younger members of large families. Number four, limited or deficient care of babies in large families with fewer social and economic resources devoted to their care and upbringing. All of these factors, they do come under the heading of social class. How your social class can impact how good or bad you do during your educational journey. Now, when we talk about cultural deprivation, what exactly is cultural deprivation? To put it in a simplistic manner, we could say cultural deprivation is the other end or other extreme of cultural capital. Cultural capital यहाँ पे क्या है? जब हम cultural capital की बात करते हैं तो we referring to the extra advantages, the advantages beyond economic advantages that a child from a middle class background has, that puts him or her in a better position as compared to the child from the working class, right? Now, cultural deprivation, on the other hand, would be the assumption that a child from the working class background is somewhat culturally deprived. A child from a working class background is somewhat culturally deprived, because of which he or she does not end up doing as well as a child from the middle class background. And when we talk about this cultural deprivation, the idea over here is that the middle class culture is somewhat superior or is somewhat better than the culture that the individuals from the working class hold, right? So because आपका middle class का culture goes in line with the way your education system is designed, and and this doesn't really work out this in the same manner for the children from the working class, तो हम ये कह सकते हैं that their culture, the culture of the working class pupils, it's deprived, right? It's they're experiencing cultural deprivation, if you put it in a simplistic manner, right? So talking about cultural deprivation over here, taking it a step further, number one, difficulty adjusting to the middle class norms. Now, we've discussed this numerous times earlier. I mentioned this a couple of minutes back as well. Children from the working class might not find it easy to be able to adjust according to the middle class norms. And middle class norms, I'm using the word middle class norms over here because the assumption is that schools or education systems, they run on middle class norms and values, right? We talk about this gentleman, we discuss him further in detail, Basil Bernstein. Bernstein in 1971 came up with the idea of language codes. Bernstein came up with the idea of language codes. Bernstein claims language codes to affect the educational attainment of pupils. And when I talk about language codes, to be particular, I'm referring to, or rather, Bernstein was referring to the elaborated code and the restricted code. It's written over here. The elaborated code and the restricted code. Let me see, where's the restricted code? Yeah, yeah. Now, restricted code. And alongside this, we have something that doesn't really go in line with this ahead, but still. Now, see, according to Basil Bernstein, he argued that working class restricted codes clashed with the elaborated speech codes of the middle class. Let me make a circle here. Clashed, right? Okay. Now, did I mention what restricted and elaborated code was? I think I didn't. Okay. Now, restricted code. Restricted code has to do with informal communication. Let's make it like that. Communication that doesn't require much of context, whereas on the other hand, if we speak about elaborated code, means elaborated expressive vocabulary, better communication, formal communication, or in other words, the way you're communicated with through your books, right? Now there are many kids who have trouble understanding what is written in the book because books require a better vocabulary. I hope we get this. So, According to Bernstein, the working class restricted speech codes they clash with the elaborated speech codes of the middle class. This influences a teacher's assessment, which eventually led to middle class pupils being overrepresented in top stream sets and bands because the middle class pupils can express themselves in the language of education. Now, when we talk about the middle class children being able to express themselves through the language of education, you know what? You cannot really, especially when you're writing down answers, there are students who end up writing in an informal manner. Don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that because, there's over here, if you see, we see this. Oh, you can't see this. There's this language of education being mentioned over here. And when we talk about the language of education, we're actually talking about formal communication skills that need to be developed by the children from the working class. When you talk about people from the middle class, they might not have a problem adjusting with this because quite of they're sort of familiar with it, right? Okay, now another question that rises over here is, do the children from the middle class only use elaborated code? No, they're not. They do not, right? They do use the restricted code too. They use the restricted code wherever required, whenever required, right? They use the restricted code, but at the same time they are pretty capable of dealing with the elaborated code too. However, on the other hand, if we speak about pupils from the working class background, they they do use the restricted code, but they aren't really in a position to express themselves well through the elaborated code. And because of this might result in them not being able to do as well as they should when it comes to the education system. The second factor that we could bring in over here would be wider economic pressure on family life. You know what? It's not only children from the working class who under pressure. Of course, this pressure is, I mean, they feel the pressure when the pressure is there on the family, right? And because of the finances back at home, at times many of them have to be a part of part-time employment, which again, at the earliest opportunity possible, which again we could bring in under the category of immediate gratification. Gratification is satisfaction, and immediate gratification is immediate satisfaction. Because, of course, at this age, the age group you all belong to, if you start working, you probably wouldn't really make much, right? And if you join work somewhere, that would hardly have any chances for progress. And because working class students, they usually have pressure from home, pressure to support in terms of finances back at home. This can result in many of them having to quit education, right? So, wide economic pressures on family life, this results in working class children leaving school at the earliest opportunity, immediate gratification. In contrast, middle class families are future oriented, and we could bring in the term deferred gratification, what's written over here. Deferred gratification for them. Deferred is delayed, right? So, you all are studying today. Inshallah, once done with IELTS, you join your university. Once you're done with your bachelor's, master's, you would start working somewhere. You're delaying this gratification so that whenever you get the so that whenever it's time for the outcome to be enjoyed by you, it's a lot as compared to you joining something right now and earning this much, right? So it was immediate gratification versus deferred gratification. Immediate gratification का term was used for the middle class pupils, and deferred gratification was used for the middle class pupils, right? So moving on, according to Goodman and Gregg, they found that around 80% of the most affluent mothers assumed, around 80% of the most affluent wealthy mothers, they assumed that the child would go to university, whereas only 40% of the least affluent hoped. Now look at the difference over here. 80% they assumed that the child would go to university. However, over here, 40% of them they hoped, probably wished and prayed that the child could go to university. They also found that children from poor families believed that they were less academic and were consequently less concerned about doing well academically than their middle class peer. As different class cultures are built around different norms, values, beliefs, and attitudes, pupils from the middle class consider educational qualification as an important way through which they could maintain their class positions, an important way through which they could maintain their class positions. Now, maintaining these class positions, we had discussed this in the last class or the class before that, I believe. What happens is, through education, through providing education to their children, what the middle class can do over here is they guard downward social mobility. They guard downward social mobility for their children, right? Like, remember, if you remember, what I said was, if the child from if a child from middle class background, if he or she is not going up, what the parents can do is they could offer them protection or guard them by merely by getting them educated, so that whatever their parents class position is today, that the kids are of course enjoying it, they do not really go down, right? So moving on, as different class cultures are built around different norms, values, and beliefs and attitudes, pupils from the middle class consider educational qualification as an important way through which they could maintain their class positions. However, pupils from the working class consider work-based route to money and status as more important, again through immediate gratification, right? Marxists argue Moving on, Marxists argue that education systems are dominated by middle class norms, values, beliefs, and ideologies, and I've said this at least 50 times. While some working class subcultural groups succeed by adapting successfully to the environment, others do not. Underachievement, therefore, is a byproduct. This is a nice one here. Underachievement, therefore, is a byproduct of rejecting school values through things such as staying away from the school, truancy, and exclusion. This is has to do with absenteeism, when kids stop going to the school, absenteeism. Clear? So, rejecting school values by staying away from school, by not listening to whatever the teachers say, by not obeying authority, by not adapting the right attitude that would get them get through or progress while getting educated. Get it? Taking it a step ahead, if we have a look at what Westergaard and Ressler have to say over here, according to Westergaard and Ressler, working class parents, they do have a high and increasing interest in their children's education, but they lack the means to translate that interest into effective influence on their children's behalf. Now, if we have a look at this one, you know what, in contrast to what we had discussed about this earlier, let me remind you where we had spoken about how Douglas claimed that middle class parents show more of interest in their child's education as compared to working class parent, right? Now we are criticizing that. I'm trying to give a counter argument to that. According to Westergaard and Ressler, ऐसा नहीं है कि वर्किंग क्लास के पेरेंट्स का अपने बच्चे की एजुकेशन के अंदर कोई इंटरेस्ट ना हो, राइट? इंटरेस्ट उनका होता है, they're just not able to translate that interest into effective influence on the children's behalf, possibly because of lack of resources and funds, right? However, on the other hand, a child from middle class or upper class, their parents do have interests and the resources as well. Do you see how? I mean, we could study this under the heading of the positional theory, but positional theory isn't really a part of your book, though. Yeah, I wouldn't like to, since we're revising this, I wouldn't like to get into a lot of details, but a simple idea, you see how the position of a middle class child and a working class child, they're so different. Not only a middle class child and a working class child, their families, their family background, how they're differently positioned, right? Now moving on, this investment that we're talking about, it isn't only economic investment. Yes, economic investment is there, but along with economic investment, it is emotional investment as well. Now when I keep on saying this to kids, look at the amount of investment your parents have done, That investment isn't only investment in terms of money. It's the dreams, it's the emotions, it's the hopes. It's a lot. It's actually a lot. Now, economic investment involves things such as buying private education or tuition. Emotional investment involves middle class parents being able to influence the focus and direction of a child's education decisively. Mothers in particular invest time and effort in their children's education. Do I need to explain you this? You all of you see this happening, right? Nowhere else at your place, right? This emotional labor includes not just helping with homework, but also making sure that the school is providing appropriate levels of support, teaching, and testing. I've seen how parents are so concerned when you call them for a parent teacher meeting. And yeah, it's way beyond economic investment. And the rest, I don't think requires any explanation. Yeah. Now, taking it further, we had spoken about, to remind you all, we are discussing all of this under the heading of social class and educational attainment. And as we refer to social class and educational attainment, let's speak about Basil Bernstein again. Basil Bernstein, the person I'd spoken about like over here. Remember, we spoke about Bernstein over here, right? This is the person. You may have a look at how he looked like, right? Having a look at what Basil Bernstein had to say about language codes in detail. Now, what I had said back then was, according to Bernstein, there are different language codes, and we name them as elaborated codes and restricted codes. And these elaborated and restricted codes do affect the educational attainment of pupils. One thing I like making clear over here, according to Bernstein, these restricted and elaborated codes, they are not class specific. I'll say that again. According to him, they're not class specific, but they used in different situations and for different purposes, right? When we're saying they're not class specific, we're talking about the different situations or the different purposes where you use them, right? Now, a middle class child, like I had said, elaborated codes are usually used by middle class alone, whereas restricted codes are used by the working class as well as the middle class pupils, right? Now, a pupil from the middle class might use restricted code when communicating with friends, right? At times you don't need to provide a background, or you don't always have to define context, right? If you're out somewhere and your mom's types down a grocery list, not a complete grocery list, if just, if even if it's simply something as simple or basic as breads and eggs, you know they're expecting you to get it back on your way home, right? Or anything along those lines. If you're at college and you're done with your classes, and if you just type down to your sibling, older sibling, or your parents, even if you write done, they know what you're talking about, right? They know you're talking about getting done with classes, and they'd have to make arrangements to get you picked up, right? So it's not that this restricted code is only used by the working class. It is indeed used by the middle class too. But at the same time, the middle class, they're equally equipped with the middle class. They equally equipped with the elaborated code. They know where to use what, right? If they're having an interview somewhere, they know they have to communicate through the elaborated code and not the restricted code. I mean, imagine a child from the middle class or the working class walks in for an interview and goes like, "Hey mate, what's up?" It doesn't really work like that. You're going for an interview, you need to communicate with the people who are there in a more formal manner. You need to be more expressive, you need to use better vocabulary, you need to communicate well, and all of that comes under the heading of elaborated code. So yeah, these are a few characteristics of the elaborated code and the restricted code over here. Taking it a step further, Bernstein argued that restricted codes are used by all social classes. However, elaborated codes are more likely to be used by the middle classes, and this is significant because education systems are based on the use of both restricted and elaborated codes. As such, middle class children have a significant educational advantage because education involves the development of new knowledge, new higher levels of understanding, abstract thinking, and reasoning, moving away from the simple shared meanings and a requirement to use elaborated codes. Get it? Now, moving on. How is this significant? We talk about two reasons behind this, the significance of these codes. Working class child, a working class child first has to learn the elaborated code and then proceed or progress. Whereas a middle class child usually is well equipped with the elaborated code beforehand. So that's an extra thing to be done or to be taken care of by a child from the working class, right? Working class students must first learn the elaborated code of the school before they can learn the knowledge being taught. Number two, the restricted codes of working class speech clash with the elaborated codes of middle class teachers. A child from the working class, if a child from the working class, because they're used to speaking like that when they join school, when they're at school, if they try communicating or if they're communicating with the teachers through the restricted code, it might not really work in their favor. The teachers might find it inappropriate and at times disrespectful too. So that can result in a clash between the students and the values that the teacher holds. A good example here is of Mauritius, if you talk about cross cultural comparisons, where teachers may involve a mix of languages English, French, and Creole. Middle class who are more fluent in English and French, the elaborated codes of the school have an advantage because of the familiarity with these languages. Middle class students are able to express themselves in the language of education. They're less likely to find themselves placed in the lower streams, sets, and bands through teachers' assessment. Do we get this? I hope we all do. Now, this concept of language codes, like I said, was put forward by Basil Bernstein. And if I take this a step further and if we try scrutinizing this, taking it a step ahead, remember, Basil Bernstein came up with this idea back in 1970s. If you compare that with today, it was 1971, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, it was 1971. And as I speak over here, it's the 30th of March 2021. That is good about 50 years back. The question is, are these language codes as significant today as Bernstein claimed they would be? Question mark, right? While the kind of class-based speech differences that Bernstein described were at the time a relatively important feature of life in the UK, the same is not necessarily true in the 21st century. Working and middle class speech patterns have arguably flattened, or in other words, the differences between them have sort of been reduced. And middle class youth, in particular, now use restricted forms of speech that were once used mainly by the working class. The truth is, and there's another explanation, sociological explanation again, and according to that, teachers, even teachers today, your teachers at school, at colleges, they end up using restricted codes too, because the idea, the purpose is to help a student, to help a child understand, right? And yeah, so Bernstein said what he had to back in the 1970s. It did make a lot of sense. It does make sense even today if you talk about a country like ours, or South Asian countries, or developing countries in general. But if you talk about the Western world, if you talk about the UK, these differences that existed to such an extent back then, they probably have flattened down today, right? Now, moving on. Bernstein acknowledged that his research only showed differences between working and middle class language codes. It leaves open the question of how to explain class-based achievement differences. They could be interpreted as cultural deprivation too. A failure by working class children to mix fully into the education system. Cultural deprivation. Remember, again, for the I don't know how many time I've said this, the idea that schools run through the middle class value systems, and if a working class child, or if the working class children are not able to adapt to that, they might not be able to progress or do well in the education system. Alternatively, another explanation, another important thing over here could be, at one point, let's talk about comparison between uh, this and this. Let me just write it down. Okay. Now we're talking about two different explanations over here. I'm talking about a comparison between this one and this one. Okay. At one end, what we're doing is we're blaming the working class pupils to not be able to adapt to the values of the schooling system, right? And on the other hand, you know what? Instead of blaming the working class pupils, we could actually blame the education system. Don't you think it's the education system's responsibility to work in a manner that works well for everyone in general and not just specifically pupils from the middle class background? It is indeed their responsibility, right? To, I mean, if the education system claims that it works on meritocratic principles, don't you think it is the education system's responsibility to investigate what happens at school, to look after comparison between both of these explanations, what can also be brought in over here could be parental attitudes again. The possibility. I'm sure some of you at least might have come across a situation like this where you try to have a communication with your domestic staff about what their kids are studying, and if they're even studying, and they end up being like, saab padhai se ya baji padhai se kya hoga, and you know statements like this, they pretty much reflect that they don't really see any ray of light or hope from the education system. In other words, we could say that the working class pupils, because of their home background, because they've internalized their home background so well, that they have come to see the education system as a system that isn't really for them, wouldn't really be able to help them, right? We could discuss this under this term parental deficiency too. According to Hannafin and Lynch, they suggest that this idea of parental deficiency in the form of working class parents not valuing education is not correct. They argue that many working class parents, both black and white, take a keen interest in their children's education but feel excluded from participation in making decision making within schools. If we scrutinize as to how the education system works, there's a possibility that teachers, the principal, the school management, they might be ready to take suggestions, advices more from the parents from the middle and upper class background, and they might not really include parents from the working class when it comes to all of this, which might result in them not being able to show the level of interest that they probably do have. And remember, something similar to this, we did discuss this a couple of slides back under the heading of Westergaard and Ressler, right? So, Westergaard and Ressler, one, number two, Hannafin and Lynch, and number three, Blackstone and Mortimer. According to Blackstone and Mortimer, again, working class parents, before we start blaming working class parents for all of this, have we even wondered if the jobs that they do even allows them to show their involvement in the child's education? There's a possibility that they do want to, they feel like participating, but their jobs, they don't really allow them or give them enough of time. Now, a simple example, imagine there's someone who comes to your place early in the morning to paint, is supposed to finish the work in the next 3 4 days. Half day down, if the person asks you if he may leave to go attend a meeting somewhere, a school meeting somewhere, I don't think many of people would allow this. They'd be like, why did you even come today then? You should have taken it off, you should have come tomorrow. Or the people involved into manual work, do you think their jobs would allow them to participate in any of these things, any of these activities at school? They might not. Number two, working class parents may be very interested in their children's education, but they're put off going to school because of the way teachers interact with them. Now, this and this, they're similar. Look at the names. The names are different. Get it over here. And this again is something that's not there in your book. I just thought of adding this here. I hope everyone gets this. And in contrast, the middle class women in race study were better positioned to involve themselves in school decision making. Better positioned because they're educated themselves, because they are in a better position to keep a check on what, in terms of what is going on at the child's school, what all is the child studying in a particular day. Now, I hope everyone has understood this. Initially, we spoke about these two different explanations. We compared them. When we then we hopped on to parental attitude. We spoke about how parents from the working class background, they might not be valuing education, because of which it reflects in the child's attitude towards education. Then as a counter argument, we discussed this part, and then in support of this we discussed this, and then this, and finally this. I hope everyone gets this. Moving on, according to Mirza also cites the development of Saturday schools. Now, what exactly are these Saturday schools? When you talk about these Saturday schools, these are initiatives that are taken by many black parents communally. It's a community initiative. And this is there to help students with their education on Saturdays, right? Or an extra help of an extra support system. The question is, when do you think extra help is सीक्ड और रिक्वायर्ड? एक्स्ट्रा हेल्प की तब आपको ज़रूरत पड़ती है ना, जब आपको लगता है कि जो आपके पास ओरिजिनली हेल्प मिलनी चाहिए वो आपको मिल नहीं पा रही. Probably there's some sort of deficiency in the state schools, because of which children from working class, majorly Afro-Caribbean, Black Caribbean backgrounds, they've decided to come up with a communal initiative to be able to help their pupils, to be able to help their kids do better, right? Mirza also cites the development of Saturday schools among Black Caribbean communities as an evidence for a commitment to education not being recognized within the state school system, right? Number two, another explanation locates parental attitudes within an underclass which is distinct from the rest of society. Moving on, according to McDonald and Marsh, in 2005, they found no evidence of a distinct deviant underclass culture in the research in Middleborough, England. What they found was a complicated picture of a poorly treated youth struggling to come in terms with their low status and social exclusion. It's not only about education. Very conveniently, many people have established a very stereotypical image on of how these working class youth is trouble, they're troublemakers, how they're deviants, how they're a part of anti-school subcultures, being a part of underclass cultures. But there's a possibility that they're just young individuals who are trying to cope up, or who are trying to struggle to come in terms with the low status and social exclusion. Everyone would want some sort of acceptance, good way or the bad way. I'm sure you'd agree, at school, at colleges, a child who's Either studious gets popular or the deviant ones. What if the child who's trying to gain popularity through deviance doesn't really have any other way? What if they trying to look for recognition? What if they're trying to struggle to gain some popularity because they can't do it the other way, they try opting for this one? Yeah. Now, moving on. According to Meckengale, working class underachievement is not explained by the culture of working class boys, but by changes in the labor market. There's been a decline in manufacturing industry. Let's link this to topic number 5.1, theories of the role of education, where we started off from. There's been a change in the economic system, and because of it, there have been economic changes, social changes, cultural changes. There's been a very evident decline in the manufacturing industry, and this decline in manufacturing industry has led has left many working class pupils without any purpose. They don't, I mean, they know for a fact that their parents won't be able to invest in their education. Their parents might not be able to provide them with the funds that are required. I mean, if you could link this up with the study that was conducted by Paul Willis, Learning to Labor 1977. Remember what I had said while discussing that was these lads have probably been able to see through the smoke screen that Marxists keep on referring to. They know that there's been a decline in manufacturing industry. There'd be lesser jobs for them. At the same time, they know the parents won't be able to, what's the word, fund their education ahead, their higher education. What do they do then? Right? For example, the decline in manufacturing jobs has effectively excluded such boys from the traditional forms of industrial employment and left them as a relatively marginalized group within the education system. Now, I hope everyone gets this. We have discussed all of this under the heading of the relationship between social class and educational attainment. If you remember, I started off with out school factors and in school factors. Out school factors, Kender, what I had said was आपका social class plays a very important role. And up till now, we've been speaking about different factors, majorly beyond school, जिसकी वजह से आपका education attainment पे affect आ रहा है. From the next slide onwards, we have to discuss in school factors and how these in school factors majorly, I mean, they revolve around social class only. This you'd see when we do it. Now, how in school factors or whatever happens within school affects things such as labeling, ability grouping, pupil subcultures in relation to social class only, right? Majorly. We talk about how this affects the educational attainment of pupils as well. And I think this is I think all of this so far has helped. Mind it to remind you the topic 6.2, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, 6.2, social class and educational attainment. We're done with half of it, but it hasn't really come to an end yet. That is pretty much it for today. Take care of yourselves, stay happy, healthy, safe, and protected, stay humble, stay amazing, take good care of yourselves, and Allah Hafiz.